Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 72 and I am the show's host Kyle. Joining me on today's show is Will Porter. Will Porter is a journalist and commentator with a focus on U.S. foreign policy and Mideast affairs. He is a staff writer for the Daily Sheeple, and some of his freelance work can be found at the Libertarian Institute and at antiwar.com. So how are you doing today, Will?
I'm good, Kyle. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for what we have to talk about today. I invite you on the show today specifically to talk about a Marc Thiessen article from the Washington Post, where he lays out his case for why the Trump foreign policy in Syria is awful. He is concerned about the Trump administration creating a jihadistan in South Syria, and is worried that the Trump administration is just going too hard after the Islamic State, and that is making Iraq or Al-Qaeda more powerful. So if you're ready, we'll start going through this article and breaking it down. And I'm on the show notes page for this episode. I'm going to link to something that Will published, which is his notes for this show. If I have any significant notes, I will add them in as well, but this will allow you to go back through, see all the links, and know that we're the ones. All right, so let's start. He opens his article by saying, imagine that the president's national security team walked into the Oval Office and proposed the following U.S. foreign policy in Syria. Let's create an Al-Qaeda haven in southern Syria by working with Russia to establish a ceasefire area where the terrorist network behind 9/11 is free to operate without fear of U.S. attack. All right, well, why don't you jump in and start telling us what you think of the opening statement.
Yeah, sure. So Thiessen is saying right in the beginning here that essentially the latest ceasefire agreement in southwestern Syria, or in southern Syria, is it's giving Al-Qaeda a safe haven. However, the Al-Qaeda groups in Syria aren't particularly active in the south. In fact, in the southeast, you mostly have U.S.-backed rebels, with along the border with Jordan there. And then in the southwest, you have some other, a very small pocket of rebels. But some of these are friendly with Israel, like that Wall Street Journal report showed, that the Knights of Golan, it's an Israeli-backed rebel group. So that's who's operating in the south. Really, it's in the north around Idlib where HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which we've talked about on this show, that's the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, that's really where they're active. So when Thiessen's saying an Al-Qaeda safe haven in the south, this doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like he really knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, and we know who the other rebels are in southern Syria because they've been covered a little bit because of the U.S. airstrikes against Hezbollah and allied Shia militias in the area. Those are the rebels in the area at the, training with U.S. troops at the garrison at Al-Tamf that are operating in the area.
Right, so if that's Al-Qaeda, then that's a very explicit admission that that's the U.S. backing them there, because those are our rebels.
Yeah, that's what I thought was so strange. I was like, is he admitting that the U.S. is arming Al-Qaeda, or what's going on here?
Right. But Assad and his militia allies, as we've also discussed on this show, we discussed the several incidences where the Americans have bombed Assad-friendly militias in the south. But that's a sign that they actually control large parts of the south, and they have no interest in creating an Al-Qaeda safe haven there. Assad has been fighting Al-Qaeda this whole time. But America, though, does, or at least did for some time, that we did have some interest in seeing the rise of Salafist or jihadi groups in Syria. In fact, there's a declassified 2012 DIA memo that calls for the creation of a Salafist principality, which is a synonym with Islamic State. Essentially, they're saying that there's a radical opposition in Syria and that we want to back it in order to isolate the Assad regime. And so if there's anyone who's backed Al-Qaeda in Syria, it hasn't been Assad. This has been Assad or Russia or Iran. This has been the United States.
Absolutely, Will. And part of the other, in this opening statement, he never mentions the jihadistan that actually exists in northern Syria. As you mentioned about around the city of Idlib in the Idlib province of Syria, where Al-Qaeda, the HTS group, controls almost the whole thing. Never in this article once does he mention it, and it's kind of like, if your neighbor drives, let's say, a kind of car that you're going to buy, and not asking him about before you going out and buying it would be a pretty strange thing to do. And so to not even mention that there's a jihadistan, existing in northern Syria is a very strange and dishonest omission.
Yeah, especially there's been a recent, pretty high-profile story about the Al-Qaeda faction in Syria taking over Idlib. Like, they're doing this right now. This isn't old news. This is in the news cycle.
Absolutely. It looks like we tackled that segment pretty well, so now I'm going to read the nets of Marc Thiessen's piece. Then we have the Pentagon tell most pro-American Sunnis who want to fight with us that they will arm and train them only if they sign a pledge promising not to fight the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which has massacred their families with mortar and poison gas. They likely driving most of the fighters into the waiting arms of Al-Qaeda, which promises to help them against Assad. Then let's cancel the covert CIA program, which we did, and we allow a small number of rebels to fight Assad. We put our word that they are doing so as a concession to Moscow.
Yeah, so my first reaction to this paragraph is just to say, what pro-American Sunnis? And this is a very common thread throughout this whole article, is he keeps talking about the Sunnis. He has this very strange fixation with the Sunnis. But, I'd ask what pro-American Sunnis. In an August 2014 New York Times interview with Thomas Friedman, even President Obama, this is a guy who was all about backing the rebels, even Obama started to say, he doubts that there is much of a moderate Sunni opposition to back. And he told Thomas Friedman, there's not as much capacity as you would hope regarding the Sunni opposition as for moderates. And so if that were true in 2014, that there weren't any moderates to back, how much truer is that today? I mean, the whole point of at least ostensibly, the whole point of the CIA and Pentagon's arm and train programs was to find these moderate Sunnis. And they failed. They couldn't find them. And so there's that, the idea that there's a moderate Sunni force. Okay, well, where are they? However, then there's this other idea that, encouraging rebels not to fight Assad is somehow going to help Al-Qaeda, which is Assad's greatest enemy. That's a ridiculous idea on its face. How do you hurt one group by helping its enemy? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, and he also has this throwaway line in here saying that the Assad has massacred civilians with poison gas, and you've addressed that twice on the show before. So if you just give us a short summary and just blast this little throwaway line he has in there.
Yeah, sure. Investigative reporter Seymour Hersh completely threw cold water on this whole idea regarding the chemical weapons attack in April in Khan Sheikhoun. And that was published at Die Welt, a German newspaper. And that corroborated what retired CIA officer and Army intelligence officer Phil Giraldi told radio show host Scott Horton in an April 6 interview. So that all corroborates that it's very likely that it was not the Assad regime that carried out any chemical weapons attack. And then another incident in 2013, the same journalist, Seymour Hersh, also debunked assertions that Assad did that one too. And so this claim is really it doesn't have a leg to stand on regarding the chemical weapons.
Absolutely. And so thanks for taking care of that one for us. I know it was just a little throwaway statement, but it's just part of the overall propaganda of his argument that Syrian Sunnis are good and everybody else in Syria is a bad actor, I guess. It seems to be his general thoughts. Part of this section of the piece that really struck me was that he was complaining about ending the CIA program that armed the Syrian rebels. And Will, I know you've covered this well, so do you want to just talk quickly about the actual results of that covert CIA program?
Yeah, sure. And so we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, at least about the ultimate desires and goals of the administration, at least the Obama administration. In a 2012 DIA memo, they said they wanted to foment the rise of radicals in order to isolate Assad. And so even when they were paying lip service to backing moderates, they were still pouring weapons into an opposition that was dominated by jihadis. And so even if they did find a handful of moderates to back, backing any of these factions is only going to empower the strongest elements, and that would be the jihadists. And so any of America's arm and train programs have been, in fact, either directly or indirectly backing Al-Qaeda. And so stopping the arm and train program is a great thing for if we want to, defeat Al-Qaeda or whatever. We should stop arming the rebels who are allied with Al-Qaeda.
All right, great. Well, thanks for filling us in there. Is there anything else you want to mention on that last section?
No, I think we covered all that.
All right, great. Thanks. Well, the next section is Instead of Sunni fighters, we will team up with the Kurdish Marxist People Defense Force YPG, a terrorist organization at odds with NATO ally Turkey. We'll use the YPG to attack just the Islamic State, leaving Al-Qaeda unscathed and thus helping it reassert its supremacy over the rival leadership of the global jihad.
Right, so first on this one, notice how the author just asserts that the YPG is a terrorist organization. And he said they're at odds with the NATO ally Turkey. Well, first of all, he provides no evidence to back this assertion that the YPG is a terrorist organization. He might be trying to refer to the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, who, yes, they have carried out some terrorist attacks inside Turkey, but the YPG is a distinct group. And so this is just, I have no real incentive to defend the YPG, but I just find it ridiculous that he can just, another throwaway line where he's just, making a blatantly unsupported statement there.
Well, it seems to me, Will, just real quick, very hard to make the case that the YPG is a terrorist organization and something like the Free Syrian Army isn't then. Because if you look at it, the Free Syrian Army is absolutely tied with HTS and has some alliances. They share motives and ethnicity just like the YPG and the PKK. So in two sections right next to each other, he's making contradictory arguments there.
Right. And I would also say that Turkey, for its part, he's saying that, at odds with NATO ally Turkey. Well, why are we so interested in bending over backwards to appease the Turks anyway? The Turks have been, affiliated with all kinds of radical Sunni factions, including ISIS. And there's a great study that actually shows a lot of their potential links with the oil sales and a lot of other kind of dealings with the Islamic State. And so why should we be trying to appease Turkey like this?
Yeah, I believe around the time that the Syrian civil war was starting, a lot of foreign jihadi fighters were reported to have come to Syria through Turkey.
Exactly. That was sort of one of their major functions, was providing a corridor into Syria.
Yeah. And, all right, so now we're going to move on to the next section of the article.
Oh, excuse me. There's one other thing I wanted to say about that.
Oh, absolutely.
About the second half of that last paragraph where he said, we'll use the YPG to attack just the Islamic State. I found this ironic that during the liberation of the city of Aleppo, the imperial press they complained to no end that Russia and Assad, they weren't targeting ISIS, they were targeting these other rebel groups. They were kind of like, those are our rebel groups, those are our moderate guys, when really these were a bunch of jihadis. But now it's completely opposite. Now now Thiessen is complaining that we're only attacking ISIS and not the other factions. So it's funny how the goalposts move so often.
Yeah, and I mean, not only that, I know Arar al-Asham and then Tarar al-Asham, both Syrian rebel groups, have been allying with Turkey to attack the YPG, and so there's a lot of reported fighting going on between the YPG and other linked groups to Al-Qaeda.
Sure, I mean the YPG too has been taking cities and territory from ISIS consistently for years. They've been very strong against ISIS.
Absolutely. The next section then, let's have Defense Secretary James Mattis say publicly that we shouldn't do anything to push back on the unprecedented expansion of Iranian military force in Syria, and even suggest that Iran can help with the fight against the Islamic State, totally undercutting the president's state aim of being tough on Iran.
Well, first of all, the president makes a lot of claims and says a lot of contradictory things, so I don't think we can always hold him to what he's saying there. The president also made a pledge to fight, radical Islam, and perhaps that term best applies to the Islamic State and their ideological cousins and, their financial benefactors in Saudi Arabia. And so joining Iran to fight the Islamic State, if we have to do something in the Middle East, that actually sounds like maybe a smarter idea.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with you on that. It seems to me very obvious that if you're going to, look at between Iran and Saudi Arabia and see, who's helping the kind of U.S. strategy and who's hurting it, well, Saudi Arabia tends to support groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are the clear and stated enemies of the American people. Right,
precisely. And Thiessen makes mention of Mattis's remark that we shouldn't do anything to push back the Iranian militias or Iranian-backed militias in Syria. And honestly, I'll be honest, that is surprising to me. He's usually very sort of Iranophobic and hawkish toward Iran and anything Iran, related to Iran. And so I think that was a welcome development, though, that he's saying, all right, well, maybe we should just sort of compromise and deal with these militias and not fight them.
Yeah, I guess the real this section just came off very strange to me, that this guy is complaining about Mattis not wanting to attack the groups that are attacking Al-Qaeda, since he's so paranoid about Al-Qaeda getting strong in Syria. If there's one group that has really gone after the Syrian rebel groups, it's been the Syrian Arab Army. I mean, while the YPG has certainly attacked jihadists, mostly the Islamic State, kind of probably for regional reasons mostly, the Syrian Arab Army has been taking it to Al-Qaeda all over the areas around Damascus and Palmyra and now Deir ez-Zor.
Right, Aleppo, yeah.
And Aleppo. And so it just seems ridiculous that if your big fear is Al-Qaeda, then why are you, so concerned about Iran and Iranian-backed militias? Right.
Why is he so eager to pick a fight with another country? And before we've sort of sorted out our 7 or so ongoing conflicts, it's a really bad idea to pick a fight with Iran at this point.
All right, the next section. Then we'll have Secretary of State Rex Tillerson say Russia has the same interests that we do in Syria, so we can help Al-Qaeda recruit more Sunnis to its cause by telling them that the United States is allied with Russia, Iran, Alawites, Shiites, Kurds, in a campaign to annihilate them. A message which will have no effect on the response because it will be true.
Yeah, so I would ask to this, does the United States have to make the rest of the world into enemies in order to combat Al-Qaeda, or what? Because it's just like, Thiessen is not having any of it. We cannot ally ourselves with anyone because they're also enemies of, I guess he's saying enemies of Sunnis, but it kind of sounds like he's arguing that, those are like enemies of Al-Qaeda. And so, I don't know, it's almost like he's concerned with their feelings or something. But as of now, if you look and see, it's very clear to anyone who looks that the United States is not an ally of Russia or Iran or Assad. It's very clear, despite the author's, suggestion to the contrary. Yet somehow, all this time, despite the fact that we're not actually allies, groups like Al-Qaeda, groups like ISIS have nonetheless found a way to recruit Sunnis into their organization. And so even without there's no alliance between America and Russia and Iran and Assad. And yet, even without that alliance, they've still found a way to recruit. And so the author's argument does not make sense here.
Absolutely. And he's saying that, once again, paranoid about Al-Qaeda in Syria, but then he's saying that when everybody in the world teams up against them, that's somehow a bad thing. It's just kind of a nonsensical thing to believe.
Right, he's going to... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. Oh, I was just going to point out, we're about halfway through this article now, and it seems like we're beating up on this guy pretty bad. And I just want everybody to know that Marc Thiessen is not just some, hack who has a random blog on the website. This was published in the Washington Post. He was the head speechwriter under George W. Bush for his final year in office. From 2001 to 2004, he was the speechwriter for Donald Rumsfeld. So this is a serious person that we're taking on here. It's not just some random chump.
Yeah, and he is a consistent supporter and advocate of the warfare and surveillance states and all sorts of things. So this is not a very savory character.
All right, the next section of his article. Current U.S. strategy empowers Al-Qaeda, which has an army in Syria, is preparing to replace ISIS, and is more dangerous than ISIS, says a recent report from the Institute for the Study of War and American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project.
Yeah, so I find this very funny that he's citing the Institute for the Study of War and the American Enterprise Institute. People within these institutions, these are neoconservative institutions largely. And a lot of the people in part of these institutions have been the advocates of every terrible foreign policy in the last 15 years at least. Definitely the Iraq War. And so you would think that after a decade and a half of horrible foreign policy advice, people would just stop listening to them as experts. But I guess you just have to change around the acronym from PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, to ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, and then the fools are turned back into experts.
Well, the thing I thought interesting about this statement is less about maybe Thiessen and more about just kind of the general establishment foreign policy view. It was only 4 or 5 years ago that the radical strategy was we had to support Al-Qaeda and ally with Al-Qaeda to take on ISIS because ISIS was so dangerous. And now that I think the writing's on the wall that the Islamic State is on its way out, largely because of Shiites in the region, they now need a new boogeyman. And, well, they've been arming ISIS or Al-Qaeda for quite some time, so I guess it's about time to turn the threat again that way.
Right, just turn right back to them, turn on their heel, right back to the prior threat.
All right, the next section of his article. Our approach, the report declares, he referring to the Institute for the Study of War report, is inadvertently fueling the global Salafist jihad insurgency because the Sunnis see the United States as working with their mortal enemies.
Well, this is kind of hitting on a similar point that he's already made, where he's saying that if we work with anybody else, we're going to hurt their feelings and make them mad and join Al-Qaeda. Hurt the Sunnis' feelings if we work with Russia or Iran or Assad. And so I would ask again, who are we supposed to work with then? The author gives us all these huge, he tasks the United States with these grand global projects, but he insists that we have to make enemies out of anybody who might at least share some of our goals, ostensibly. I don't know if the United States really has an interest in defeating Al-Qaeda or ISIS in Syria. However, ostensibly, that's the goal. And the United States has certainly bolstered Al-Qaeda through its foreign policies. That began with the invasion of Iraq, which the people at ISW and AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, they supported that. So that was backing Al-Qaeda. They were totally for it. And then again, we backed Al-Qaeda when Obama doubled down and backed the Syrian opposition, as we've been talking about, which again, these hawkish think tankers, they support all this. And so if anybody has inadvertently fueled the global Salafi jihad insurgency, as Thiessen says, it has to be the United States. You can't look anywhere else.
All right, well, I don't think I have anything to add on that one, so we're just going to move on.
Right.
Al-Qaeda is taking advantage of this perception to build support among Sunni tribes, portraying itself as the defender of Sunni Arabs against a U.S., Russo-Iranian axis intent on subjugating and destroying them.
And I would say this train left the station a decade ago. Al-Qaeda has been around for the entire duration of the Syrian war, and yet the author is speaking as if the group is just now coming into existence. His argument is, though, a great way to just put all blame onto Russia, Assad, and Iran, totally do what Bob Higgs calls truncating the antecedent, which is where you just kind of pretend history didn't happen, and, skirt all American responsibility. This argument is a very convenient way to do those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I always like that, truncating the antecedent. When Scott Horton brings it up, he usually paints it in a very good way and understandable, just like you just did. The only other thing I would say about this section is just the use of the phrase U.S. Russo-Iranian axis. What is he talking about? This is like a loose group of enemies that just happen to be united against jihad. That's the only way you could even put the Iran, Russia, and the U.S. as having the same ambitions anywhere. And even in the cases where the one to destroy ISIS is there, typically there's a bigger fear of letting Iran have too much power for them to really act on those similar feelings of hatred towards ISIS. So I just found that really interesting that he could, with any amount of integrity, put those three countries together like they're somehow bent on global domination or something against the Sunnis.
Right. I mean, forget that. How long ago? Was it a month ago, 3 weeks ago? The U.S. shot down a Syrian jet. I mean, yeah, we're definitely part of an axis, though. We're bombing each other intermittently, but yeah, we're definitely allies here. Yeah,
Trump's saying he's going to pull out of the P5+1 deal in September and put on sanctions against Iran today for a test launching a satellite missile. So
right, Iran and Russia, the sanctions. Yeah, these are our great allies, the great axis that we're part of here.
All right. Oh, that was actually another group of that there was new sanctions today specifically on Iran because of that missile, but then the Congress is putting more sanctions on them on top of that.
Right, the one was
on
mixed.
Russia, so that's insane.
Right, the first one was mixed, right? It was Iran and Russia, and now there's a separate one.
And North Korea for that first one.
Right.
And then there was a second one today. So, messes everywhere.
Yeah.
All right, next section of the article. Alienating the Sunni population is not the way to win the war against Islamic radicalism. Right now, Al-Qaeda has established itself as the tip of the spear in the fight against the Assad regime. So many Sunnis who do not share Al-Qaeda's ideology are flocking to Al-Qaeda because it's the only game in town for fighting Assad.
Well, I would ask where all these moderate great guys were when the Pentagon and the CIA were looking to give away weapons and training to Sunnis. It's just amazing. The fact the author still believes that the U.S. can come up with this militarily capable, non-Islamist, pro-democracy faction of Sunnis this far into the war really attests to his lack of wisdom, or foresight, or even hindsight. There's some real magical thinking on display there, just to think that, the Sunni, it's a what they call a deus ex machina. It's the god of the machine. It's this thing that can just come and solve no matter how complicated the problem is, it can just come and magically solve it. That's what the Sunnis are for this author.
Well, yeah, and this may be the only true statement of his entire article, except he only, applies it to right now. This has been the case since 2011 that Al Qaeda was the only game in town for the Sunni rebels.
Yes.
And, in that time, the U.S. has just poured weapons and training into the Syrian rebels. And so, if you're looking at why there's a jihadi stand in Syria, look there first, not at, Russia and the United States agreeing that they hate ISIS.
Right, and let's take this in a different direction, too. I mean, let's assume there were some moderates there. Let's assume he's right about Al-Qaeda being mostly the only game in town. They dominate the opposition. But let's say there's some moderates that we find to back. What is backing them really going to do? What is the outcome here? We back the moderates and they march on Damascus alongside the hordes of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and then they calmly debate the pros and cons of Sharia law versus democracy? Like, truly, what does he think is going to happen here? If the opposition wins, the strongest elements within the opposition are going to be the ones to take the spoils. It's not going to be the Free Syrian Army imposing democracy. It's going to be, the radicals getting their way.
Absolutely. I actually wrote this down on my last episode, and I was pointing out that, unintended consequences of foreign policy. You think, arming the small groups of Syrian rebels who actually, believe in democracy and pro-West and everything would be a good thing. But the end result of that is they either sell or, get killed, and their weapons end up in the hands of Al-Qaeda. And so, a dream as much as, Thiessen wants to, at the end of the day, his policy or, whatever he's prescribing here is exactly what led to a jihadi stand.
Exactly. Regardless of the intentions behind it, whether there were sort of more Machiavellian intentions that they really did want to back radicals, or whether they were more sort of idealistic ones where they did want to back moderates. Either way, it has one outcome. It's not, it doesn't matter what the intention is.
All right. I think we tackled that one pretty well, so let's move on to the next one.
Sure.
Al-Qaeda's goal is to take charge of the anti-Assad uprising and slowly transform it into the global jihad against Iran, Russia, and the United States.
So I found this one pretty funny, too. And so this author is talking about how we have to sort of put Iran and Russia in the crosshairs, and Assad. We can't be friends with any of these people or with any of these powers. But doesn't this sounds like Al-Qaeda's, it sounds like their allegiance, or it sounds like their position on the whole matter, where he wants to put, Thiessen and Al-Qaeda share the same goal of wanting to take out Assad and put Iran and Russia in the crosshairs. So I found that pretty funny that they share the same goal here.
Absolutely, and that's why that one I thought was just kind of laughable and delusional and just, as I said a few times now, an odd thing to say. All right, moving on to the next section. Instead of undermining these efforts, we are helping them by focusing almost exclusively on the Islamic State and driving the Sunni population to ally itself with Al-Qaeda.
Right. So we kind of covered a lot of this already as far as driving the Sunni the population to ally itself with Al-Qaeda. This train left the station a decade ago, or not as far as Al-Qaeda itself, maybe not within Syria. But since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, I mean, Al-Qaeda has been one of the dominant factions here. So it's ridiculous to paint this as a new development.
Yeah, I mean, the part of this that how anybody could say that the reason Al-Qaeda is going to get stronger is because the United States is bombing the Islamic State too much is kind of nonsensical in itself.
Right. Yeah. On its face, it really doesn't make a lot of sense.
And again, what's he implying is the solution here, that, the United States not bomb ISIS quite so much? maybe it's time for the U.S. to start arming ISIS. That way, Al-Qaeda could we could take out Al-Qaeda until they're weak and then arm them again or something like that.
Right. And I mean, again, they complained. The American politicians and media complained when Assad and Russia were just going after Al-Qaeda-like groups and not so much ISIS. Like, it's amazing how the goalposts move.
All right, next section. This is insane. We should be working to strip Sunni tribes away from Al-Qaeda, and the United States has a proven record to draw upon. During the 2007 surge in Iraq, we successfully rallied the Sunni tribes that had been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in Iraq and got them to turn on the terrorists and help us drive them out.
So I would ask, is this author been on vacation for the last 5 years or what? Like, what about ISIS? He's saying how we had this great victory against Salafi jihadism. The Sunni tribes rallied and drove out all the terrorists. But how long did that really last, Like, ISIS, within, a couple of years, comes and takes over 10 Iraqi cities, in this huge offensive. So I don't think we can really call that a major victory. A little temporary lull in the action as the guys regrouped.
Absolutely, and thanks for debunking that lie about the 2007 surge, Will.
Yes.
Next section. The result will be both a military and ideological defeat for the Salafist jihadi cause. Not only were the terrorists driven from their havens, but they also suffered a humiliating popular rejection by the very Sunni masses who they claimed were to be the vanguard.
Again, this is just wrong. They were not driven from their safe havens. They were driven from maybe some safe havens to other safe havens, but they didn't go away. That's very clear. They came back stronger than ever in the form of ISIS. So he's trying to present this whole thing as this great victory that we can repeat. But I fear what would happen if we try to repeat this. If ISIS comes after Al-Qaeda, what comes after ISIS? How much worse can this get?
Yeah, and from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Will, but the 2007 surge, the Al-Qaeda guys, they were able to kick out. A lot of them ended up in Syria and then Libya, where we know what's happened there. Al-Qaeda Iraq forces were very strong of the foreign fighters in some of these Arab Spring movements.
Sure. Yeah, and I think you are correct about that. My point is simply that, they may have kicked them out of Iraq, across a border, across the Sykes-Picot line into Syria, or maybe they took a detour to fight in Libya. But it wasn't permanent at all. You can't really call that a victory if they came back 10 times stronger a couple years later.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I wouldn't say either you could call it a victory if they start civil wars in Libya and Syria, right. Just adding to the case against, this guy's policy.
Yes, exactly.
All right, his next sentence is, we need a similar military and ideological victory in Syria.
Oop. Hold up. Here we go. Sorry. I would just say to that, with victories like that, who needs to lose? He's kind of already made these points. It's just rhetorical at this point for him.
Yeah, we've really covered that part. All right, and then next section. So we are not working to repeat this success. This is a question. We need to restore the CIA's covert train and equip program and lift the Defense Department's restrictions preventing Sunnis who want to join us from fighting the Assad regime.
So again, let's just understand what he's saying here. So he's saying to undercut Al-Qaeda, we first just have to arm Al-Qaeda and its rebel allies and encourage them to attack Al-Qaeda's most powerful foe, Assad. Like, that's brilliant. Yeah, to hurt Al-Qaeda, we just have to do everything we can to help them. It's essentially what he's arguing here. Like, without even much, I'm being kind of cynical about it, but without even being very cynical about it, this is what he's arguing. It's insane.
Yeah, in another consequence of this policy that he's advocating for that I think he understands is that this would scotch the ceasefire deal between the U.S., Russia, and the Assad regime, and thus igniting more fighting around, some of the areas of Syria that have now finally seen some calm after maybe 6 years of civil war. And so that's terrible, and it would drive a wedge between the United States and Russia. And not only that, but if you look at what, kind of who's bombing who in Syria, the U.S. is really just bombing ISIS, and Russia is bombing ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so if you, upset Russia, or if he's going to, hurt the U.S.-Russian relationships, but that's the group of people that are attacking Al-Qaeda. And so it seems silly to do things to upset those people.
Right, and I always found this distinction ridiculous, where they try to make a distinction between, those aren't ISIS guys, those are rebels. It's like, okay, these are dudes who have a radical Islamist ideology, they're carrying rifles and rocket launchers, and they're taking over cities violently. Like, how do you really distinguish between a rebel and an ISIS guy? It seems like they're pretty much doing the same thing, pretty much have the same goals there. So I always found it ridiculous when people criticized Russia for, oh, they're not bombing ISIS, they're bombing, Al-Qaeda-linked rebels. That's, I find that ridiculous.
Absolutely. Next section. We must then facilitate the emergence of a Sunni Arab partner in the southern Syria that will fight alongside U.S. forces to expel not just the Islamic State but Al-Qaeda as well, while helping stop Iran from imposing Persian-backed dominance by the Alawite minority against the Sunni majority.
That's quite a tall order, isn't it? I mean, that's a lot of stuff. He wants this magical. We don't even know who these Sunnis are. We don't even have this force of moderates, and this plan he's coming up with is insane. He is insanely overconfident in what moderate Sunnis can accomplish here. Again, this is like a Deus ex machina. He just wants these things. He wants the Sunnis to fill in all the gaps. He just wants them to fix everything and to fight everybody and expel everyone. I find that it's implausible. It's not reasonable at all.
Yeah, so he's calling for a ground invasion of Syria because he wants Sunni Arab forces in southern Syria, and there's only maybe a couple thousand troops down there to fight alongside U.S. forces. So there's got to be a lot of U.S. forces to expel Iraq, the Islamic State, and Al Qaeda. I mean, there's no real Syrian rebel groups that are Al Qaeda down there because the two Syrian rebel groups down there are U.S. backed and Israeli backed. And so the only way they could ever even get to fight Al-Qaeda would be to go through the Syrian Arab army lines. And any real attempt to fight ISIS at this point for the groups in southern Syria, that train has left the station because the Syrian Arab army has taken most of that ground from the ISIS forces there already. And so I'm not quite sure, even if the U.S. does build up a super strong force down there, the only people they'll ever be able to attack is Assad. And so if you look at, who Assad's fighting, and he's fighting Al-Qaeda, attacking Assad is only going to help Al-Qaeda. This seems absolutely nutty.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, it's a common thread throughout this whole thing where he keeps saying that we just have to either encourage, we have to attack him, or we have to encourage rebels to attack Al-Qaeda's enemy, Assad, and somehow that's going to hurt Al-Qaeda, to bring down their enemy. That's very inconsistent. It doesn't make any sense.
In the last sentence here, he phrases it in a way where I think it's going to kind of intimidate any Washington Post reader from actually understanding what he means. He's saying that we're going to stop Iran from imposing Persian-backed domination by the Alawites on the Sunni majority. What this really means is that there's going to be a somewhat moderate military authoritarian regime in Syria, or we could choose, to go with the majority, and that would be, at best, the Muslim Brotherhood. And so he has to use, Persian-backed domination to make it sound like this is somehow going to be worse than an Al-Qaeda or ISIS-led Syria.
Right. And this might be getting a little bit off topic, but, I've talked to some Syrians and I've asked them about, the religious persecution and stuff. And, I'm always wary about, everyone has a side, so I'm, skeptical. But I've been told that there wasn't religious persecution. There may have been some oppression in the country, but it's not on the basis of Alawite versus Sunni. It's different there. It's different in Syria. They don't, the politics aren't so religiously based, I guess.
Absolutely, and thanks for that insight, Will. The last section of his article, as the ISW-CTP report puts it, we must stop attacking the Sunni Arab community from the outside through proxies and instead embed ourselves within that population as its defenders. The Trump administration needs to understand its fundamental truth. We cannot defeat the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or the global jihadist movement on our own. We cannot do it with Kurdish or Iranian proxies. We need the Sunnis to do it.
Well, yeah, again, I just ask, what Sunnis is he talking about? The Kurds seem to be doing well enough against the Islamic State in Raqqa. Despite there have been some hiccups and problems there. We've pretty much expelled them out of Mosul. And so it sounds like he's just trying, it sounds like he's late on this game. It sounds like he could have written this column maybe a year ago or something, and it may have been a little more plausible. But at this point, it just sounds ridiculous, where he's trying to re-energize a Sunni opposition, a bunch of moderates. And I think you'll find that like these ISW guys, the Institute for Study of War guys, they all have this weird fixation about Sunnis. And it may come from the Iraq surge, but they always want to, we have to back the Sunnis. They have this fixation on it. It's kind of strange. And you can see it on display here in this article.
And of course, me and Will aren't arguing that, there's anything wrong with Sunnis at all, or that all Sunnis are, Al-Qaeda, but
Absolutely
all, it does happen that all fighters in, that are siding with the Syrian rebels are Al-Qaeda fighters in Syria. And I'm sure this has an awful lot to do of the U.S., foreign policy in the Middle East, really since the first Bush's invasion in 2001, where just so many people have died, so many people have been radicalized, and a lot of these people happen to be Sunnis.
Right, precisely. Yeah. We have nothing against Sunnis whatsoever. It just happens to be that groups like Al-Qaeda and groups like ISIS, they are predominantly Sunni organizations.
All right, so that covers it for the article. Will, is there anything you would like to say about the article as a whole, or anything to add on the Syria situation that you think is relevant to what we talked about today?
Well, I would just say it's just a shame that something like this can be published and pass off as informed commentary at one of the most, the Washington Post is a pretty prestigious newspaper. It and the New York Times are probably up there, near the top in the U.S. So I just find it to be a shame that something like this can be published and, without a bat of an eye, even though, as we showed, virtually every single sentence of this article is filled with lies or spin or omissions or disinformation or something like that. So it's really something else. This thing is like an exquisite example of an article just built out of spin.
Absolutely. The one other thing I would just add on that is articles like this do drive opinion. Congressmen read stuff like this. President Trump might read something like this, and take it on face value because they have no idea anything about, the Iraq surge of 2007 or the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite. And when they see Iran or Persia, they, quiver a little bit and have no idea what is an Alawite anyways, right? And so when they read this, they say, oh, wow, the Institute for the Study of War, they sure seem like they would know a lot about something like this. So I'll cast my vote in their direction.
Well, I think we can rest assured that Trump would certainly not read this. If it's on Fox and Friends, he might see it, but I don't think we're giving him a bit too much credit to suggest he might actually read.
This was a relatively short piece, though, Will. He only has to get through a couple hundred words. Maybe somebody could tweet it to him in about 5 or 6 tweets.
Read it to him while he's in bed at night.
Yeah. All right. So I think that about closes it down. The only other thing I'd like to add is that this wasn't a defense of Trump's foreign policy, only a refutation of the one prescribed by this particularly disgusting neocon. And so, Will, would you like to add anything to that, or then give us your plugs and let us know where to find your work?
Sure. And yeah, this is no defense of Trump's foreign policy. This is a refutation of an even worse foreign policy. However, I'm Will Porter. I'm a journalist. I write for a site called The Daily Sheeple at thedailysheeple.com. I do news and commentary there 5 days a week. You can find some of my writing at the blog at the Libertarian Institute, and some of my writing at antiwar.com in the Viewpoints section. Oh, and I have a blog, tlvanguard.wordpress.com, thelibertarianvanguard.wordpress.com.
All right, thank you so much, Will, and you can find this podcast at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. While you're there, please share the show. Sharing this show will help to refute these neocon lies and help more people get exposed to the work of myself and Will Porter, and so much of it is so important. So for all of you who could share, we thank you so much for that. You could also find my work at the blog at thelibertarianinstitute.org. I really recommend you check that one out. That way you could just find both of our works in one place. And my personal website is Kyle's Files Blog at just kylesfilesblog.com. Thanks.